Welcome to this session of the Samatha Vipassana Trust Dharma Talks. Let's start by just reciting Namo Tassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. So, welcome. And I hope your practice is going well, and that this talk will give you another way of viewing your practice and how to integrate it into so many aspects of daily life. So we're going to look at the Samyutta, the Sutta Nipata, and it's the great chapter, and it's the 12th sutta, and it's called the Dvayatanupassana Sutta, the origin of and cessation of suffering, but also known as Contemplating Pairs, which I think is a more literal translation. Thus have I heard. Once the Buddha was staying in the eastern park of Megara Matu's estate at Savatthi. One evening, on a full moon day, he was sitting in the open air with all the monks gathered around him. He saw that they were silent, and so he spoke to them. Monks, he said, it sometimes happens in this world that things are said concerning skillful states. Distinguished and liberating statements are made that lead to full enlightenment. Now, monks, why should you bother to listen to those statements? People may ask you this same question. And if they do, you should answer them like this. It is for the purpose of knowing two things as they have come to be. They may ask you what these two ideas are. If they do, you should answer them like this. The first insight is this. This is suffering. This is what causes it. The second insight is this. That is where suffering stops, and that is how you get there. So this relates immediately, if you like, to the use of the 6 R's that Bhante Vimalaramsi describes. So in the first section of the 6 R's, we can split the 6 R's into 2. The first is about moving from the unwholesome to the wholesome. So that's recognizing that suffering has arisen. So our mind has been distracted and we've taken the distraction personally. And when we do that, that is the root of suffering. We recognize that's happened, we release away, and we relax the tension around our brain. So that's the first stage. We've seen that suffering has arisen, and we understand its cause because we've released the tension around our brain, which is let the craving go. The second insight is that where suffering stops and how you get there. So with the release of the tension, the suffering stops. We then substitute the smile, and that's the wholesome aspect of the practice. So we're retraining the brain, and then we return back to the feeling of the loving kindness or taking our smile into our daily life. So those are the 2 insights, the arising of suffering and how it came about, and the release of the suffering. These are the 2 insights. Grasp them together. And in the course of a life of energy, dedication, and care, you can expect one of two results. There will either be the fruit of perfect knowledge, or if an essential component are not yet exhausted, there will at least be no further rebirths. So that's either the state of anagami or the state of the arahat. And what's going to get us there? In the course of a life of energy, dedication, and care. So here's the invitation. Care is the invitation to be mindful, to see what is going on in daily life. The energy, well, this is the application that we need to place. Not too vigorously, because that then generates restlessness and perhaps a sense of expectation. But it's the application of energy. So if you like, it's right intention. And that energy, and then the dedication, that's the persistence that we need in our practice, to keep coming back, to keep exploring, to remain curious in what we're doing. When the Buddha had said this to the monks, he went on, as teacher, to explain. There are people who do not understand suffering. They do not know where it comes from, where it totally ends, and how to get where it ends. So without a chance to emancipate the mind or achieve emancipation through knowledge, they cannot effect an ending. They can only go on and on, being born and getting old. So we can see this on and on just in the span of our own life. How, if we don't understand the cause of suffering and how to release from suffering, we continue in that cycle of suffering around whatever that trigger is. There are also people who comprehend suffering, who know how it happens, where it totally ends, and how to get where it ends. They have got the emancipation of mind and the emancipation through knowledge. Now they can effect an ending, no more going on and on, being born and getting old. So this emancipation of mind is Chaita Vimutti. The chitta is the heart mind. It's the seat of the emotions, but it also has aspects of mind, which is this comprehension, this ability to understand and experience. And then we have Panya Vimutti, which is the liberation by wisdom. And that's through seeing directly and understanding the insights. This is the proper twofold insight, but you may be asked to describe it in another way. And that you could do like this. One insight is that grasping is the basis of all suffering. The other insight is that by the complete cooling and cessation of all this grasping, there is no more arising of suffering. So this is the grasping after experience. And in the grasping, we make the experience personal. We make it me, mine, or my own. And in that process of identification with the grasping, that is the seed for the suffering. Because once we hold on to it and identify with it, then if it's something that's pleasant, we fear losing it. And so it causes suffering in that fear of it no longer being around. And if it's the unpleasant, we fear that it won't go away, that it will be around, for a long time. And so we manage to generate a sense of suffering around all of our experience. Whereas if we don't identify with it, we can allow the experience to be itself. It can arise as it is natural, the circumstances for it to arise. It stays a while and then it disappears. there are these two insights around grasping. Grasp them together, and with energy, dedication, and care, you can expect one of these two results. And that's either freedom through the citta or freedom through insight, through wisdom. There are many kinds of suffering in this world, and all of them grow from the same source, grasping. When a man knows no better, he gives way to this grasping, and slowed and dulled, he goes through one misery after another. So without the clarity of comprehension, we have this dull mind. We don't see things clearly. Yeah? So do not create it for yourselves. Use your knowledge to see how suffering begins and develops in attachment. So this grasping is an aspect of this attachment we have to experience. One insight, there is another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that ignorance is the basis of all suffering, and another is that by the complete cooling and cessation of ignorance, no more suffering is produced. So the Buddha's going through whole aspects of our personal experience and showing how we can develop insight around all of these. So these are two insights. Grasp them together, and with energy, dedication, and care, you can expect one of those two results. Either the non-returner or final liberation. Constant traveling from birth to birth, from this form to that form again and again, this is what results from ignorance. It is due to this ignorance that people's minds become dulled and muddled, that they go on endlessly wandering from life to life. But if you walk towards knowledge, you leave these rebirths behind. You do not go on becoming. So we can think of this in terms of just our own lifespan. And whilst we remain ignorant, we continually regenerate aspects of our lives which are causing suffering. But if we can bring awareness and clear comprehension to them, then we can leave this rebirthing of experience behind. And you do not then go on, re-becoming in this process. There is another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that the impulses are the basis of all forms of suffering. These impulses, now they are the sankharas, and they are an aspect of the sankharas which are, if you like, are habitual responses. So Bhante Vimramsi would often describe the way that craving moves on to clinging, and then clinging moves on to our habitual reactions. So these impulses are this aspect of the sankharas. And what we find is that the impulses are the basis to a series of reactions that create our suffering. So one insight is that impulses are the basis of all forms of suffering. The other is that by the complete cooling and cessation of impulses, no more suffering is produced. So how do we go about that? Well, these are the two insights. Grasp them together, and with energy, dedication, and care. So there's our practice. You can expect one of the two results, non-returner or arahat. So here's another aspect of our daily experience that we can use for practice. When do we see our habitual responses coming up? And do we then follow them, or do we do something different? And the 6 R's are, if you like, the key to unlock that door. When we find ourselves getting caught up in our habitual responses, it's when we've identified with what's going on, made it about me and mine and my own, and we're beginning to fuel it. But as soon as we recognize that's happened, then we can 6R. We can recognize that we got caught up, we can release away from it, relax the tension around our brain and in our body, softly smile, and come back to whatever it was that we were doing, but come back feeling lighter, expansive, open, free of tension. It's a different physical experience as well as a mental one. Every form of suffering grows out of a mental impulse. Eradicate the impulses and no more suffering is produced. So here's the 6 R's. When we release and relax and smile, we've cut off that impulse and we've come back into balance and the suffering abates. Consider this harmful consequence of the impulses, that they are the basis of suffering. By the complete calming of the impulses and the stopping of the train of perception, suffering disappears. So when we release away from this distraction that we've identified with, this habitual way of behavior, this repetitive and obsessive way that we can react to certain things, and we relax the tension around our brain and smile, what we're doing is we're cutting off the fuel to these impulses, these habitual responses. And when we do that, that moment when we release craving, we can't perceive we can't see that habitual response, that impulse. It's gone. We've seen the impermanence of it. And with its going, the suffering that it fuels begins to disappear. Wise men understand this in accordance with fact. With right knowledge, the wise ones overcome the yoke of Mara. There is no more rebirth. So what is Mara here? Well, in the suttas, Mara has a personification, if you like. It's the image of some entity which is always looking to ensnare us and pull us away from the path of understanding. And Mara is described as a deva in one of the heavenly realms who's very much enamored with sensory experience and the pleasures of a sensory experience. And you can imagine that person just wanting others to join him in that pleasure. And so that's kind of what's going on. We're being invited to join in. And what is the process of being invited to join in? It's the process of taking something personally. Because that's what then creates the environment of this is my pleasure or this is my pain. And Mara is very much about identifying with that experience. So when we choose not to identify with it, that's when we overcome the yoke of Mara. So if you like, the 6 R's are again the key that unlocks that door. If we don't want to be under the yoke of Mara, we need to work with the 6 R's so that we're no longer taking our experience personally. There is another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that consciousness is the basis of all suffering. The other is that by the complete cooling and cessation of consciousness, no more suffering is produced. So if we think of that in terms of our lifetime right now, this consciousness, the consciousness is dependent upon the sense that created it. So if we have an object like a cup, and we have a functioning eye, so we have form in the form of a cup, we have a functioning eye. When the light from the cup is reflected through into the eye consciousness exists in the brain. The meeting of those three things together, eye consciousness, the eye, and the cup, is contact, phassa. And with contact comes feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant or unpleasant. And with feeling then comes craving, the I like it, I don't like it mind. Craving then brings clinging, the story about why we like it or don't like it, and with that, that feeds into our habitual responses. So we can see that if there's no cup for the eye to be able to see, or for the light to come into the eye consciousness doesn't arise in this instant. And so with the non-arising of eye consciousness, there's no downward stream going through contact, feeling, craving, clinging, and the habitual responses. So we can see just in daily life that if we become aware of when consciousness arises through the senses and when it disappears, we begin to see that with the disappearance of consciousness, the attachment and aversion to what was being experienced also begins to disappear. So we recognize this in daily life. I mean, we can be upset by something and then somebody distracts us about some aspect of activity or whatever. And for that moment, we no longer have the awareness of the upset. So for instance, we might have a pain in our leg. And we can get caught up with the thoughts around the pain in our leg and how it's really aggravating and we're worried about it. And then we meet our friend and we have a conversation and they get us laughing about this, that, and the other. And we're not aware of the pain. So without the consciousness of that body, we didn't have the suffering. And then our friend leaves and now we're aware of the pain again and our sense of suffering arises again. So at this very simple level, we can begin to see just how the presence of consciousness and its absence determines whether we experience suffering or not. So one insight is that consciousness is the basis of all suffering. The other is that by the complete cooling and cessation of consciousness, no more suffering is produced. These are the two insights. Grasp them together, and here's the practice. With energy, dedication, care, you can expect one of those two results: eternal or an arahat. Every form of suffering grows out of consciousness. By the cessation of consciousness, no more suffering is produced. Consider this harmful consequence of consciousness, that it is the basis of suffering. But once consciousness is quietened, a person's craving ends. Total calm is realized. So without the consciousness of suffering, we can't produce contact. Without contact, we can't produce feeling, and without feeling, craving can't be there. So if the cessation of the consciousness is there, there is automatically, if you like, the cessation of the craving associated with it. There is another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that contact is the base of suffering. The other insight is that by the complete cooling and cessation of contact, no more suffering is produced. These are the two insights. Grasping them together and with energy, dedication, and care, you can expect one of those two results again. For some people, contact, the point where sense plus object meet, is enthralling. And that shows the stickiness, if you like, around the experience of contact. You know, when the mind is enthralled, it's completely identifying with that experience. Because it's enthralling, they are washed by the tides of being, drifting along an empty, pointless road. Empty because it's fabricated a sense of me, mine, and my own around that contact, which is not real. Because when the contact disappears, you know, I haven't disappeared in that sense. But then the identification with the contact is very strong. And what the Buddha said is that he didn't say whether there was a self or not a self. He wouldn't be drawn on that. But what he would say simply is that everything in our experience doesn't have the characteristics of what we would expect a self to be. In other words, all of our experience does not have permanence. There's impermanence in everything. Our experience isn't guaranteed to make us continuously happy. And our true self would always be looking after us, making us happy and making sure that everything was okay. So our true self, in that sense, cannot be something that we experience through the senses, or what we experience through the senses can't be a property of the true self, because we can both feel suffering and we can feel happiness through that. But no experience guarantees that happiness. So our experience through the senses cannot be an aspect of ourself, but that's identity with what is enthralling, with contact. We're encouraged to believe that this experience is ours, me, mine, and my own. And that's why they're washed by the tides of being, drifting along an empty and pointless road. Because of that identity. Nowhere is there any sign of broken chains. So, what are these broken chains? There seems to be this continuity all the time. Whereas others come to understand their sense activity, and because they understand it, the stillness fills them with delight. They see just what contact does, and so their craving ends. So with insight and with clear comprehension, we see the dependency that creates contact. It's dependent upon an object, an I, the I consciousness, and then the contact arises. And because they begin to see that and see how it's dependent, and it's not something to take as a personal identity, the craving, which is that process of identifying, drops away. With the dropping away, there's the realization of total calm. There is another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that sensations, this is feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, this is Vedana, are the basis of all suffering. The other is that by the complete cooling and cessation of cessation, no more suffering is produced. These are the two insights. Grasp them together, and with energy, dedication, and care, that's the practice, you can expect one of these two results, anagami or arahat. whether it is pleasurable sensation or unpleasant sensation, or neither pleasant or unpleasant, whatever is sensed internally or externally. So the 5 external senses, the eye, the ear, the tongue, the nose, and the touch of the skin, and the internal sense, the mind, one should understand all this as suffering, as deluding experience, as fragile experience. One should see it with insight, its arising and falling nature, and by this means should become detached from it, or detached towards it. The monk becomes free from craving and completely calmed by the elimination of sensations. So what's going on here? Well, the invitation here through practice is to see the arising of sensations, of feeling, and the cessation of feeling, and seeing how it's dependent upon contact. And by doing that, because we see the dependency, we don't identify with it. Because it's the identifying with it that makes it suffering. It's not that the feeling itself is suffering. It's the identification with it that is. So in another sutta, the Buddha describes that the khandhas, that's the body, perception, feeling, which we're talking about just here, the sankharas, the habitual responses, the volitional activities, and the consciousness. If we can release away from craving, they become for our welfare and happiness, not suffering. So it's not the fact that the khandhas themselves, of which feeling is one, are suffering. It's that we make them suffering by our relationship with them. And so the Buddha said, work with the relationship. Let the relationship change, and these things will be for your welfare and happiness through your natural life. The monk becomes free from craving and completely calmed by the elimination of sensations. So the elimination here is by the elimination of our attachment to the sensations. There is another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that the thirst of craving, this is tanha, is the basis of suffering. The other is that by the complete cooling and cessation of this thirst, no more suffering is produced. These are the two insights. Grasp them together, and with energy, dedication, and care, you can expect one of those 2 results. Anagami, arahat. When a man walks hand in hand with the thirst of craving, he will wander from birth to birth, now here, now there, and will never, and with never an end in sight. That's how powerful craving is. And that's why the Buddha made craving the most important teaching. And it's the most important teaching expressed in the 4 Noble Truths. The Noble Truths say that dukkha arises. Dukkha is there. There is a cause of dukkha. That's the 2nd Noble Truth. There is the cessation of dukkha, and there is a path to the cessation of dukkha. And the cause of dukkha is craving. The cessation of dukkha comes from the cessation of craving. So this is how important the Buddha considered understanding craving to be. And why was that? Well, it's because craving is the first place in that chain of experience from the senses, consciousness, contact, feeling, craving. Craving is the first place where the I appears. Feeling is an automatic response to contact, but craving is the I like it, I don't like it response to feeling. It's when we've identified. And this is why the Buddha considered the craving step to be so important. It's when the sense of me, mine, and my own comes into the experience. Consider this harmful consequence of craving, that it is the basis of suffering, and with this knowledge, you could let the thirst dissolve. The clinging would go with it, and you would be free to live, always mindful as a wanderer. So here we're identifying the very close association between craving and clinging. Clinging kind of has that stickiness about it. And there's another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that clinging is the basis of all suffering. The other is that by the complete cooling and cessation of clinging, no more suffering is produced. So here's where the khandhas come for our welfare and happiness, with the elimination of the clinging. These are the two insights. Grasp them together, and with practice, energy, dedication, and care, you can expect one of those two results, arahat or anagami. Becoming is dependent on clinging. This becoming is what Bhante Vimramsi describes as the habitual tendencies. Yeah. When one comes to suffering. A person who is born dies also. This is the product of suffering. So this becoming is this regeneration, and we can think of this as life and death over many lifetimes, but we can also think of it within our own lifetime and our own experience from one moment to the next, We're constantly rebirthing through our habitual responses. And the thing about the habitual responses is that they're often generated by past karma. And so if we're not careful about how we work with our experiences, if we let them fuel another reaction, a similar reaction again, we're reinforcing whatever originally created those. And that informs our next moment. And so the present time moves round into the next present time, as it were. And we're constantly rebirthing this. And the invitation here is to do something different. And so, perfected in understanding, the wise dissipate all clinging. They have seen how the forces of becoming can be stopped. So this is the observation, this is the insight in our practice. When we use the 6 R's and see how craving and clinging drop away, this is the insight that we need to build upon. So they have seen how the forces of becoming can be stopped, so they do not go towards more births. Now that could be life-to-life birth, but also it's useful to think of this in terms of our daily life. We're not birthing again our habitual reactions and responses. We're giving ourselves a break. We're coming out of that repetitive cycle, and we're enabling ourselves to come back and see the situation for what it is, rather than through the filter of our past experience. There is another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that effort is the basis of all suffering. The other insight is that by the complete cooling and cessation of effort, no more suffering is produced. Okay, so the effort here is the if you like, the inception of energy. It's what support. It's the energy we're putting in to this identity, and we need to take that effort out. It's not the effort of the 6 R's, because that's right effort. This, if you like, is an effort that's being talked about here, which is, I think the Pali for this is aramba, and it's not virya. Right effort is virya, but this aramba is the energy we put in as a consequence of identifying with what's going on, and that's the energy that we need to take out. So that's the energy of when you get distracted. Maybe you get angry about something. Well, we're all familiar with that. We've taken something personally, we get angry. We feel the energy rising in us. This is what's being described here. This is what needs to cool. And we use right effort to cool this. And right effort is expressed as the 6 R's. These are the 2 insights. Grasp them together, and with energy, dedication, and care, you can expect one of those 2 results. Every form of suffering grows out of effort. Eradicate effort, and no more suffering is produced. Eradicate this, the energy, the inception of energy, the start of that. You feel the energy rising in you when you're working with us in a certain context, or where you're responding or reacting to something. You can feel the energy rising. At that point, 6R, let it cool, come back. Every form of suffering grows out of effort. Eradicate effort, and no more suffering is produced. Consider this evil consequence of effort, that it is the basis of suffering. But when all effort has been abandoned, there is freedom, the freedom of the effortless. So the freedom from this inception of energy. So we're not getting pulled into things, or pushed away from things is a sort of repulsion. Let that energy drop. For the person whose feverish thirst for the person whose feverish thirst to be is destroyed, and the mind has become calm, the cycle of birth and rebirth is left behind, and there is no more coming back for rebirth. So here, this feverish thirst, think of this as this energy. When you allow it to cool, it begins to disappear. And so the cycle of rebirthing experience also disappears. There is another way of describing this 2-fold insight. One insight is that nutrients are the basis of all suffering. The other is that by complete cooling and cessation of nutrients, no more suffering is produced. Well, this is one of the favorite things that Bhante Vimaramsi would talk about. How we feed the hindrances, the nutrients that we give it. And he would often reference a sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya. And this is in the Mahavagga, the great book, and it's in the 2nd chapter on the factors of enlightenment, the Bhajanga. And it's the 2nd sutta there. And he says, monks, just as this body sustained by nutriment subsists independent on nutriment and does not subsist without nutriment, so too the 5 hindrances sustained by nutriment subsist independence on nutriment and do not subsist without nutriment. So this nutriment, this feeding of the hindrances. And what Bhante Vimaramsi would say is, well, what is this feeding of the nutrients that we, feeding of the hindrances that we give? And he'd say, it's when you give the hindrances your attention. That is the nutriment for the hindrances. So One insight is that nutriments are the basis of all suffering. The other is that by the complete cooling and cessation of nutrients, no more suffering is produced. These are the two insights. Grasp them together, and with energy, dedication, and care, you can expect one of those two results: arahat or anagami. Every form of suffering grows out of nutrients. Eradicate these nutrients, and no more suffering is produced. So we can see in the Sutta, there are so many potential sources that we're going to fuel the suffering. So we have so many opportunities in our daily life to see this engagement and to release from it. Look at the harmful consequence of nutrients, that they are the basis of suffering. When you have comprehended all nutrients, you do not get attached to them. So when we see that giving our attention to these things fuels them, it invites us to do something different. And what is the difference we can do? It's the 6 R's. When someone fully understands that what is healthy, then they can do away with the mental poisons, and these are the asanas, the deep obsessions. He can stand firm and clear-sighted in the practice of the teaching, as a person fulfilled, as a being beyond definition. So this is, if you like, when the deep obsessions are released, this is the deepest knowledge that we can come to understand. This is the arahat. There is another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that mental agitations are the basis of all suffering. Okay. So this is, if you like, the mental, but also the physical agitation in the body. So we can think of this as perhaps as including restlessness. The other is that by the complete cooling and cessation of these agitations, no more suffering is produced. These are the two insights. Grasp them together, and with energy, dedication, and care, you can expect one of those two results. Every form of suffering grows out of agitation. Eradicate agitation, and no more suffering is produced. Consider this harmful consequence of agitations, that they are productive of misery. Therefore, give up agitation, break the impulses, and free from agitation and clinging. Let the monk mindfully wander along. Oh, agitation, restlessness. It's not the same as restlessness here. It's a Pali word in Jeta. And it's this, if you like, agitation in the mind and in the body that we need to quieten. And it's often these sort of agitations that we're so used to that when the mind begins to calm down, we can sometimes feel that we're missing something, that there's nothing there for us to see going on. And it takes a little while for us to realize that as the mind begins to settle, this is actually a much more spacious and wholesome place than a mind that is full of agitation. Consider this harmful consequence of agitation, that they are productive of misery. So they cause us suffering. And their absence was the opposite. Therefore, give up agitation, break the impulses, and free from agitation and clinging, let the monk mindfully wander along. There is another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that there is trembling. For one who is dependent. So when we're dealing with dependency, there's this trembling in the mind. The other is that the one independent does not tremble. These are the two insights. Grasp them together, and with effort and dedication and care, you can expect one of two results. The independent Student does not tremble or get confused. But a student who is dependent on something is clutching and grasping at existence in one form or another. They cannot escape from existences. So we hold on, and we can hold on in a very obvious and clear way, or we can hold on very subtly. So we can hold on to perhaps experience in our meditation, these very fine, refined states of mind, which feel so nourishing. And at one level they are, because they're not dependent on the hindrances. They're independent of the hindrances. And so this is how the jhanas develop, because the hindrances are not present at that time. But we can get caught up in even these very fine and refined states of mind. So we can cling on to them, we can clutch onto them, we can grasp them. One of the classic things that Sister Kima would talk about is that she would have students come to her and complain that as they were beginning to move through the jhana states, the feeling of joy was disappearing. And so, the attachment to the feeling of joy would come through, and it's like, oh, I don't feel the joy anymore. But because the mind is focusing on the loss of the joy, what it doesn't see is the arising of the compassion. And the compassion is a much more spacious, open, and a more refined expression of the joy that it's replaced. Consider this evil consequence, that there is a grave danger in being dependent. Therefore, relying on nothing, the mindful monk wanders on, free from clinging. So when we have a dependency, when we hold on, we identify. And with that identity, we hold back our practice. So even refined states, and they're very tempting, if you like, to identify with, because these are the things that feel so wholesome and good. But even these are things not to hold on to, as we allow ourselves to experience and pass through the various stages of development. And we can think of this also in terms of daily life. If we are holding on to things in daily life, it's not long before, we're caught up in the whole dialogue around what happens if I don't hold on to this? What happens if it disappears? And it becomes a crutch. It becomes something that we're leaning on to. We begin to feel that it's necessary for our existence and for our life. And sometimes we can feel this perhaps when we have children who are growing up and getting to the stage of more independence and possibly getting to the stage of leaving home, and we've got all this identity around being a parent and our role and what that represents, and we're being invited to let that go at some degree. And that invitation to move into a different identity can feel very, very painful. And yet, if we don't identify and simply take pleasure and joy in the development and expansion and outward-facing nature of children as they develop and leave home, our experience can be very different. Consider this evil consequence, that there is a grave danger in being dependent. Therefore, relying on nothing, the mindful monk wanders on, free from clinging. There is another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that there is more calm in the formless than in the form. And another, that there is more calm in cessation than in the formless. There are these 2 points, grasp them together, and with effort, dedication, and care, you can expect one of those 2 results. Beings who do not understand cessation will come back to the process of rebecoming. whether those beings be those of the sphere of form or of the sphere of the formless. But those beings who have understood the nature of form are well established in the formless and free themselves in cessation are the ones who leave death behind. Okay, so one of the ways we can look at this is in terms of the jhanas. So we have the rupa jhanas, the form-based jhanas, and we have the arupa jhanas, the formless jhanas. And roughly speaking, you could say the first four jhanas were the form and the second four the formless. But as we move through the jhanas, this is a progression of progressive cessation. Aspects of each jhana drop away and then drop away as we go through each of these. They become more and more refined, preparing and developing the mind to allow the dropping away of identity altogether, that, making the experience mine and my own, that represents the movement through towards cessation. So here we have a description of working through the jhanas. And but we could also look at this as the material and the immaterial. And in our daily lives, we can be attached to the material. Well, the material things are easy to lose. They're easy to get broken or to be stolen. And so if we merely identify with the material, then we're going to have less calm in our mind than if we identify with the immaterial, which might be our memories or our thoughts about people, or the sensations around the experience that we have, the way people make us feel. But again, if we hold on to that, well, the things that we recognize around even these experiences, they can't be stolen, but our memory fades and the experience changes, and we've all experienced, times when we've been very happy in someone's company, and then maybe that person has not made us so happy on occasions. There's no reliability around that formless. It's still subject to change and variability. And it's only when we become independent of either the form or the formless, only then can our mind be truly calm. And so this comes down to the lack of preference, if you like, around what happens. When we have preferences, then we set ourselves up to experience suffering. If we allow the preferences to release so that we can be accepting of whatever happens, irrespective of, perhaps our best efforts for one thing to happen or another, then we will be much calmer. And I'm reminded of a lovely saying from a Tibetan teacher called Lama Yeshe. And what he says is, when we expect our life to be up and down, our mind will be much more peaceful. And I think that's a lovely encapsulation, because our temptation is to think, I will be peaceful when my life isn't up and down. But what he's saying is something quite different. He's saying, when I expect and accept my life will be up and down, then I will be much more peaceful. And so that's, moving towards the same comment from slightly different direction here. So one insight is that there is more calm in the formless than in the form. Yes, there's more cessation. The other is that there is more calm in cessation, complete cessation, than in the formless. So beings who do not understand cessation will come back to the process of rebecoming. So if we have our attachment in the form, or if we have our attachment in the formless, this is going to be generative of re-becoming and re-experiencing the sort of patterns of suffering that we're perhaps familiar with under certain contexts. But those beings who have understood the nature of form are well established in the formless and free themselves in cessation, are the ones who leave death behind. And death in this context, if you think of it in terms of our own particular life, is that it's this constant rebirthing and dying of experience. But if we want to leave that process of death and rebirth behind, we need to come to this place of balance. And from the point of view of going from one lifetime to another, the context of the anagami or the arahat, well, of course, they've cut off rebirth. There is no more rebirth in the human realm. There is another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that what the world at large, inclusive of its maras, recluses, Brahmins, as well as men and rulers, thinks of as truth, the higher beings, the men of worth, see quite clearly through their superior wisdom as false. The other is that what the world at large, inclusive of its maras, recluses, Brahmins, as well as men and rulers, thinks of as truth, the higher beings, the men of worth, see quite clearly and thinks of see quite clearly as truth. So what we've got here is what the world perceives as truth. Higher beings and those who, the worthy ones who have practiced, see as false. And those in the world, what the world see as false, these higher beings and people who have practiced see as truth. So here's a paradox. These are the two insights. Grasp them together, and with energy, dedication, and care, you can expect one of those two results. Arahat and anagami. In the world, inclusive of its gods, substance is seen in what is insubstantial. They are tied to their psychophysical beings, that's the mind and the body. And so they think that there is some substance, some reality in them. Oh, this attachment to the mind and body makes it feel as if there's a strong sense of self. But whatever be the phenomenon through which they think of seeking their self-identity, it turns out to be transitory. So what is it that makes up myself? Is it my physical body? Well, that kind of changes over time, and there can be many differences in the physical body. So is it my feeling? Well, pleasant, unpleasant, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. It comes and it goes. It doesn't stick around. Is it my perceptions, my memory, my capacity to name things? Well, perceptions and memory, these are not permanent things either. You only need to ask two people who've witnessed perhaps an accident or some event, and you'll get two different descriptions of what went on. Each they perceive as the truth, but the detail will be different. So where's the reliability in the perceptions in that sense, in the memory? Is it in the habitual tendencies and the volitional formations, the sankharas? Well, we can see how those can change depending on the context in which we experience whatever our experience is. And we've seen with consciousness that it's dependent here, isn't it? Depending on which sense comes up. So, whatever phenomenon through which they think of seeking their self-identity, it turns out to be transitory. It arises, stays around for a while, and then drops away. It becomes false. For what lasts for a moment is deceptive. So it's a bit like holding on to water. It just runs through our fingers. The state that is not deceptive is Nibbana. That is what the men of worth, those who practice, the worthy ones, know as being real. With this insight into reality, their hunger ends. Cessation, total calm. So in the Dhammapada, we have this little phrase, verse, Sabbe Sankhara Anicca. All volitional formations are impermanent. Sabbe Sankhara Dukkha. All volitional formations, habitual tendencies, everything else that's in willed activity of the body is dukkha, has the capacity to be dukkha because we can attach to them. But sabbe dharma anatta, all phenomena is without self. And in that sabbe dharma phenomena is included nibbana. So this identity, all dharma, all phenomena, is without this identity. And that is why Mara cannot touch someone who has become enlightened and moved into Nibbana. It's not a realm in which Mara can operate because Mara needs that sense of identity to be present. There is another way of describing this twofold insight. One insight is that the world at large thinks of as pleasure, the higher beings see quite clearly as suffering. The other is that the world at large thinks of as suffering, the higher beings see quite clearly with their superior wisdom as blissful. These are the 2 points. Grasp them together, and with energy, dedication, and care, you can expect one of those 2 results. Whatever there is, which is said to be existent, the delightful, the enticing, the pleasant forms, sounds, tastes, odors, tactile sensations of the body, and thoughts, these are all agreed upon by the world, inclusive of its gods, to be happiness. In the world of the practitioner, these things, in your world, these things are thought of as pleasures, and yet when they cease, they are thought of as sufferings. To the higher beings, when the individual body and personality comes to an end, it is considered to be blissful. But this varies sharply from the way it is seen by the rest of the common world. So we can think of this as life and death of an anagami or an arahat, but we can also think of it in the timescale of our own lives, day to day. Because if we're attached to the individual body, and if we're attached to a personality, suffering follows it. But if the individual body, the sense that the body has an individuality to it, an identity to it, and the sense of personality, this attachment to experience, the taking our experience personally, if that comes to an end, then that is considered to be blissful. And the happiness that comes from that is beyond any description of happiness that the experience in the world, the worldly experience, supports. What is generally called blissful is called suffering by the worthy ones, those who practice. And what is generally called suffering is known to be blissful by them. Be aware of this paradox. It is difficult to understand, and the ignorant are in error in this regard. It is dark where they are trapped. It is pitch dark for the blind and crystal clear for the wholesome. For those that can see it, there is light. But if you are blind to the teachings of the way, if you are blind to the teachings of the way things are, if you know nothing of the path, then you will not be able to make out anything, though you may be right on top of it. So one of my early teachers used to say to me, the truth is just sitting here on your shoulder, but you just can't quite see it. And what you need to do is develop your breadth of mind, your peripheral vision, so you can see this. And I've always liked that description because that ties in so nicely with Bhante Vimoramsi's description of releasing tension, tranquilizing the bodily formation, tranquilizing the mental formation. It opens the mind out to this wider perspective. This teaching about the way things are does not become a force of full enlightenment for someone who is infected with desire, yearning to be, or for someone who is in the grip of Mara. So here we're back to this energy. If we're too earnest in our desire to practice and to make progress, we need to ease back a little bit. The desire is understandable and it's very commendable, but it's getting in the way. We need to ease back a bit. When we've got that desire, our mind narrows down. And when we ease back a bit and take it a bit lighter, and as Bhante Vimoramsi would say, have fun in the practice, then we begin to open out. And if someone's in the grip of Mara, well, remember, Mara is only powerful when you identify with your experience. If we don't have that identity, it's we who become powerful, not Mara. For who else can justifiably reach this state of full understanding except for those beings of distinction? Who else has come to understand this state and dispersed all the forces of confusion? So one of the root causes of confusion is this personal identity. So we've seen through this sutta, there are so many different places in our daily life where we have the opportunity to engage and witness the teaching and experience the consequence of our understanding. This is what the Buddha said on that occasion. The monks were full of gladness and joy when they heard these things. Indeed, some 60 monks let go of all clinging and grasping during this talk, and they were freed. So perhaps just take a few moments, just sit quietly. Relax in your hips, relax your shoulders, let your spine softly grow. Find your point of balance as you sit. Relax any holding and bracing around your brain and softly smile. And whatever you use as your object of meditation, perhaps using your spiritual friend or you're working with the directions, allow the feeling of loving kindness to come up. Relax any holding and bracing around your brain and softly smile. Don't resist or push. Soften and smile. And feel your contact with the ground through your feet or through your legs, or the sitting bones. Become aware of your breath. Gently breathe in and breathe out, and slowly and softly open your eyes. And do you have any questions? Hello, Sachin.
Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm very good. Very good to see you.
Sir, good, sir. It is a good opportunity for us to read Sutta Nipata. Just I want to know, like, in every instances where the Sutta is explaining, let us say if we take one of the thing in contemplation, when a mendicant meditates in this way, they can expect enlightenment or non-return. Exactly what is the intention, like in this way, means in which way it is meditation the Sutta is explaining?
Basically, what that's referring to, and it recurs many times during the Sutta, is if we see each of these opportunities, or any one of them, with complete clear comprehension. If we see it clearly, as described, then we will have released away from that sense of identity, and by that complete release of identity, we will bring about the understanding of the arahant or the non-returner. So it's about seeing each of these ones, and there are many different forms. So there's many different entry levels that we can look at. And if we see it very clearly, and so that's, if you like, with the eye of wisdom, then that clarity will bring us the release, either the release through the citta vimutti, or the release through wisdom, panya vimutti. Is that okay?
Like, yes, it's my understanding is that we should understand it comprehensionally, completely.
Yeah. So there's two aspects to understanding. There's the, if you like, the knowledge of the teaching, the framework in which the experience is occurring. And then there's the direct vision through our own practice, which is the confirmation of that framework through our personal experience. So intellectual understanding is not sufficient. We have to develop that vision within our own practice as well. And then the two come together. That's the knowledge and vision of things as they actually are, which then leads to dispassion in the disenchantment. And disenchantment simply means that whatever we're observing, we've got many different instances of things here to observe. Whatever we're observing, we don't get caught up in it. We don't identify with it. So there's the disenchantment. And because we don't identify with it, then the dispassion comes. So we don't get this emotional engagement with it because it's no longer me, mine, or my own. And so then we can see it from a place of balance. And that's the liberating awareness that then feeds in to cessation.
One more question I have, sir.
Of course, yeah.
In the Sutta Nipata, there is a word used as heart's release.
Please say that again. Heart's release, or
exactly what its heart's release it meant in the Sutta.
Okay, I'm probably working from a slightly different translation.
Okay. I have seen the Bhikkhu Sujata's translation. In first instance, they have mentioned that they are endowed with the heart's release as well as the release by wisdom.
Heart's release is it's the word citta. And citta is, if you like, the heart mind. It's an aspect of mind which is, if you like, the seat of the emotions. It's also the seat of intention. Chaitana comes from the same root as citta. Chaitana is intention. And the thing about intention is that it can be wholesome or it can be unwholesome, or it can be neither wholesome or unwholesome. And that's why, in terms of the practice needs to be, if I can find that, it needs to have energy, dedication, and care. You know, we need to direct the mind in a wholesome intention. And then that begins to condition and work with the chitta, where the various insights then develop this capacity to release through the chitta itself. Is that answer your?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you for answering.
No
Thank
problem.
You.
Questions are, there's more teaching in the questions, I think, than just listening to the sutta. So this is good. No problem.
Yes, sir.
And your questions get me to think as well, which is really, I'm never quite sure what's going to come out until I've heard the question. Okay. Does anyone else have a question? Any other questions? Just give you a couple of minutes just to have a think, just in case you have a question. No? Okay, so let's just finish with the closing chant and prayer. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanking you all. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.